ទុកបាទលោកអ្នកនាងមានស្ដាប់នឹងទស្សនាជាទីមេត្រីនៅពេលនេះយើងមានភ្ញៀវកិត្តិយសមួយរូបដែលបម្រើការក្នុងកិច្ចការងារគាំទ្រនិងឃ្លាំមើលសកម្មភាពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សស្ថានភាពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សនៅក្នុងប្រទេសមួយចំនួននៅអាស៊ីហើយលោកបានអញ្ជើញមកដល់ស្ទូឌីយោរបស់យើងនៅរដ្ឋធានី Washington ដោយសារយើងមិនចង់ខាតពេលវេលាយើងជជែកពិភាក្សាជាមួយលោកអំពីរឿងសិទ្ធិមនុស្សនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាជាភាសាអង់គ្លេសយើងសូមអធិស្ឋានដោយពុំមានអ្នកបកប្រែ I'd like to welcome you to our studio, John.
Thank you.
John Sifton is Asia Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch. And well, thank you so much for taking your time to come to our studio today. And I'd like to begin with this. Can you tell our listeners and viewers briefly what the Magnitsky Act can do to kleptocrats around the world and how it applies to certain Cambodian government officials?
Certainly. The Global Magnitsky Act is a new piece of legislation passed by Congress in the last few years that expanded on a bill that was originally designed solely for Russia. As everybody knows, Russia has engaged in human rights abuses both internally and invading the Ukraine and taking Crimea. And as a result, Congress sought to create a piece of legislation that would allow the government to sanction Russian abusive commanders and abusive government officials. Then people in Congress decided that why are we just focusing on Russia? We need a global bill that allows the President of the United States to impose targeted sanctions on human rights abusers, seize their assets in bank accounts, but also cut them off from the banking sector so that they're not able to do banking in Singapore or Sydney or London or wherever. Because any account that is in U.S. dollars, even if it's not a U.S. bank, might be affected by the sanctions.
It falls under the jurisdiction of the Magnitsky Act. Is it different from the new legislation introduced in Congress called the Cambodia Democracy Act 2019?
Yes, there's several pieces of legislation. In the House side, there is a bill that has already passed, and then in the Senate, there is another bill which was introduced but hasn't passed the Senate, and both would strengthen the capacity of the administration to impose those sanctions. Specifically, what it does is it almost forces the State Department to tell Congress which Cambodian officials are implicated in gross human rights abuses. And once those names are sent, those people are supposed to then be listed. Right now, there's only one single Cambodian official who's been listed under Global Magnitsky. But if this legislation went in...
Can you tell our listeners who the name
is? He's a sort of subordinate in Hun Sen's bodyguard unit, not a very particularly high-level person. One of the things that Senate staff have been suggesting, and we've been suggesting, is that if you really want to impact the CPP, you have to list people higher up, people who are commanders of the military, the gendarmes, so people like Paul Saran, Klun Kim, because that would really get the government's attention.
Right. Okay. Do you think this Magnitsky Act alone can and will change the perception of the Cambodian leadership on cracking down pro-democracy activists and legitimate opposition members?
Well, that's the idea. I mean, the idea is that the CPP hasn't paid a price for what they've done. They have destroyed the political opposition, which was already very weak. It's completely destroyed. The media has been damaged severely. There's no independent media really in Cambodia anymore. And there's over 30 political prisoners. So there needs to be a price put on this behavior. And if the price starts to ratchet up and senior CPP officials find that they can't travel to the United States. They can't visit relatives who live in the United States. They can't do banking in Singapore. They can't get access to money. And their corrupt, ill-gotten wealth can't be moved around easily.
Right.
It imposes a real cost on them, and that may make them think it's not worth it to crack down on the opposition in this way. We have to give some measure of freedom to the opposition and to civil society.
Right. Speaking of freezing their assets, do you think the Cambodian government officials have moved their asset around outside of the U.S. jurisdiction
I think
already,
that,
to your knowledge?
There's a lot of focus on assets, but the real sanctions in the Global Magnitsky Act are not so much about having assets seized, although there may be. It's really about how banks will stop doing business with people who are on the list. If you're put on this list, it makes it extraordinarily difficult to move money around the international banking system in U.S. dollar denominations. So if you're going to do it, you're going to have to do it in a different way, which will have higher transactional costs. Right. To put it simply, let's say Kun Kim was listed. Right. He would find it more difficult to move money around, and that would make it more expensive for him to operate. It wouldn't destroy him financially, but it would make the costs of his activities more. Right.
Speaking, Kun Kim might not be able to do the things you just described. Can he transfer his assets to someone else?
It really depends a lot on the banks. The banks decide, who they're going to do business with. Right. One of the benefits of the legislation is that it doesn't just put restrictions on individuals. It raises the possibility of the U.S. government imposing sanctions on the entire family of,
the Prime Minister.
So say somebody like Net Savion, his wife, the niece of Hun Sen, is involved in many businesses. Right. And, if she is also wrapped up in the sanctions, it's going to start imposing financial costs on Kun Kim, Paul Saran, Net Savion, the whole sort of family, because there's a lot of relationships. There's a lot of familial relationships between these people, and once their relatives start getting listed, it could have a real impact on even Hun Sen himself. Right. And the point is not to punish these people for the sake of punishing them. It's to make them change their behavior. Right.
You said one name, we happen to know who that person is General Hin Bun Hieng. Mm-hmm. General Hin Bun Hieng. Besides,
who has been sanctioned, yes.
Right, has been sanctioned. So far, only him has been sanctioned. Has your organization, Human Rights Watch, compiled a final list of names of Cambodian kleptocrats for the U.S. Congress for the purpose of blacklisting or freezing their assets in the U.S.?
We've made
who else?
We've made suggestions. If you go on our website, we wrote a report called The Dirty Dozen, which is about 12.
Yes, I've seen that. Yes.
We've suggested many of those. All of those people are eligible, for instance. Right. And, we've suggested that there are other names that local human rights groups in Cambodia have suggested, and that the State Department and the Treasury Department ought to be engaged with civil society to talk about who should be sanctioned. Yeah. But there's also other discussions underway about sanctions. I mean, as viewers are probably aware, the European Union also has a sanctions regime, and they're also reviewing Cambodia's trade preferences. Yes. And the United States also may review trade preferences. Right. That's another form of pressure. But to be frank, the best pressure is targeted sanctions on military and police and security officials implicated in abuse. That's the best.
Forces,
get their attention that way.
Right. Now, at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing last week, you spoke at length about what Cambodia has gone through, the problems and all sort of things. Yes. You supported the position to keep the GSP, generalized systems of preference, not to remove it, since withdrawing or revoking it would do more harm to ordinary Cambodian people than the corrupt government official. Don't you think this position would let the abusive government continue destroying democracy, violating human rights, and ignoring international obligations?
Let me clarify.
Okay.
It was not that It was not that Human Rights Watch thinks there should be no withdrawal. It's that we think that there should be a review because the review is a threat hanging over Cambodia. And that's an opportunity for the United States government to say, we're reviewing this.
Okay. We
need you to make changes. And if you don't, then we may remove your privileges. And then, so what we're suggesting is not that it shouldn't be done. We're suggesting that it be done in a particular way. It be done as a process where the government is essentially threatened with the removal of the privileges. Now, what would this mean in real effect? Well, the biggest exports from Cambodia to the United States in dollar terms are probably garments.
Right.
And they aren't even subject to this regime. Okay. So even if you pulled it back, those garments would be at the same tariff levels. So what this is really about is actually only a few things. It's seafood and footwear and luggage, which is a big part of the exports, but nothing compared to the exports to the EU. Okay. The European Union, in many respects, is the more important trading partner to Cambodia. Right. And in what they decide in Brussels potentially could have a bigger impact on Hun Sen and the CPP than anything the United States does.
Right. So the European Union is using EBA, like that, as a tool, leverage, to force the government in Phnom Penh to change its attitude.
That's right. Unfortunately, there's been a change in the EU government because there's a new European Parliament. They've elected a new head of the European Commission, the new foreign minister of the European Union, and a new trade minister. So they're going to have to reevaluate this whole policy. But yes, there is right now a review of Cambodia's trade privileges with the EU. And I think it's a good thing. It's gotten Cambodia's attention that if they don't show progress and change their behavior, there could be some very serious economic impacts. Now, would it hurt ordinary Cambodian workers? That's a big question. Yeah. It's not clear, and I don't think anybody should just say it would or it would not. It's quite possible that if there were tariff increases, companies wouldn't pull out of Cambodia. They would instead just go to the government, go to the CPP, and say, we have higher costs, so you need to lower your fees and your taxes and your transportation. You have to do something for us to make us whole again. Right. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways in which the Cambodian government could decrease costs. Right. They could lower the number of national holidays. Cambodia has more than any other country. They could lower transportation fees and port fees and container fees, things like that. And they could basically make up for the difference.
Right. Okay. All right. In your view, what is the precondition, I should say, for lack of a better term, or prerequisite that will influence the U.S. or the EU policies to help restore democracy and reverse autocratic trend in Cambodia besides double talks?
Right. Well, there's never really been democracy as such, but there has been political opposition. Right. I mean, Hun Sen, in election after election from 1993, 1997, 2003, and on, every time has used violence and intimidation and corruption to win these electoral processes that aren't really democratic. Right. But throughout, the opposition was allowed some space to exist, as was media and civil society. The difference is, in the last, 3 to 5 years, ever since the 2013 elections, it's gone from an abusive authoritarianism to just outright one-party rule, de facto one-party rule. Right. And so at this point, we're not even talking about creating democracy. We're just talking about going back to where we were in 2013 when there was, some amount of opposition. Even that would be progress because we've gone so far backwards.
Right. Yeah, the international community has invested a lot in Cambodia to try to at least, start somewhere promoting democracy or democratization, because that country had been through communism, dictatorship, and all sorts of things, killing field. And we have let this government stay in power too long. Yeah. So in your view, I mean, from a distance, what would be, an effective tool to change the leadership perception in Phnom Penh?
Well, I think
They can't go on like this forever.
Ultimately, we have a situation where the government has to allow the opposition in some respects, and how the change will come in the end, how there will not just be CPP dominance, nobody knows. But what's clear is there's never going to be democracy unless there's some amount of political opposition and civil society that's allowed to exist. How the change will come, I don't know. But what we're suggesting is punitive sanctions, tougher diplomacy, because right now the CPP has basically been given the message that it can do whatever it wants to do.
That's true.
The fear is China. Japan, the EU, the U.S., what they're afraid of is if they are tough on Cambodia, then Cambodia will just get closer to China. But I've always thought that was kind of funny because, of course, they already are close to China.
Yeah.
And so it's impossible to drive them any further into the hands of the Chinese government. Already there's so much Chinese investment and so much Chinese involvement in Cambodia that if there's any more, it probably will backfire and cause problems for the CPP. I mean, anti-China sentiment is increasing in Cambodia. And if they get any closer, it may actually destabilize them, not make them stronger.
Right. We have a question for you from our listeners and viewers. Her name is Janet Singh. She used to be on our show here too. She asked this, when H.R. 526 is implemented, how likely is it going to affect Mr. Hun Sen and his family and his administration, knowing that China is backing him?
Right. So the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress has passed H.R. 526. Yeah. To make it into a law, a Senate version has to pass. The Senate version, which is most similar, it's not the same, but similar, is the Cambodia Return on Investment Act, or Return and Investment Act, which is a Senate bill. Yeah. It's been introduced by Lindsey Graham and some co-sponsors, but it has to be approved by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and then put to a vote on the Senate floor. And that's, quite difficult. The Senate committee responsible for that legislation is dealing with Iran and Saudi Arabia and Burma and China and Russia. And so it's very difficult to get Cambodia on their attention. But so the thing that we're asking people to do in the United States is call their senator and tell them, if they're interested in human rights in Cambodia, the Senate needs to pass this companion bill.
Right. So do you know how far has it been now? Is there any prospect of getting the Senate passage?
It was introduced in May.
Okay.
And, it's been difficult just to get Burma legislation through the Senate, and that was, a genocide in Burma.
Right.
So
the Rohingya refugee.
Exactly. So it's very difficult to push this forward.
Yes.
But again, if Americans, Cambodian Americans, other Americans, everybody call their senator and say, look, I want this Cambodia legislation passed to the Senate. It helps. That's the kind of thing which gets senators' attention when their constituents call them.
Yes, that's true. Okay. All right. What can the main opposition party, as far as the CNRP, led by Kem Sokha and Sam Rangsi, do to reconcile with Hun Sen and his CPP-dominated government and National Assembly? What can these two, pro-democracy leaders do to?
I hesitate to give advice to a political party. We are not partisan. We don't support.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, we point out that the CPP is abusive because they are abusive. Yeah. They have a long record of being very abusive, and they've taken over the security forces. Right. The Central Politburo of the CPP is the central leadership of the army and the police and the gendarmes, and that's very bad. But just because we're criticizing the CPP doesn't mean we're political. We don't support the CNRP. We just want there to be healthy democratic competition, whether it's the CNRP as an opposition or some new group or whatever. Right. So I don't have any advice for the CNRP. I mean, mainly at this point, my sense is that if the CPP is going to change their behavior, it's not going to be because of anything CNRP does. It's going to be because of what Brussels and London and Washington and Japan and Tokyo do.
Yeah. Well, the opposition party leader, one of them, at least Sam Rainsy, has been, traveling around gathering support, rally support in the EU and in the US and Australia and New Zealand to perhaps somehow influence the Cambodian government to accept the opposition presence in Cambodia. That's what he has hoped for. Mm-hmm. But so far, Hun Sen has been adamant to send him to prison first if he returns. Yeah. So I don't know how this is going to reconcile if you want to negotiate and then the other side said, no, we are not going to negotiate with you.
It's impossible. Right. But in 2012, Sam Rainsy was in exile. Right. And, a lot of governments put a lot of pressure on Hun Sen to let him come back and compete in the 2013 elections. I think maybe Hun Sen thinks he made a mistake when he did that in 2013. Perhaps he says to himself, I should have never let Sam Rainsy come back because I underestimated how much support he had, and so he won't let him back. But at the same time, he's facing enormous pressure. Hun Sen is facing enormous pressure for not allowing the opposition to exist. Right. And if he keeps creating pressure, ultimately it may change his equation where he thinks he can allow the opposition to function again. Right. And maybe he thinks that they're not a threat. The problem is they view the CNRP as a threat. Yeah. And instead of calling them the political opposition, they use words like treason and traitors and enemies. Right. That's very dangerous rhetoric.
A group bent on creating chaos. Color revolution? That's the term used all over Cambodia.
Yeah, and they say that because they feel threatened. Yeah. Whether they believe it or not, I have no idea. But it's very dangerous rhetoric, and it destabilizes Cambodia to talk in that way about a political opposition group.
Okay, another listener has this question. Would the UN and the U.S. cater a second chance, or care, perhaps, I'm not quite sure what he says here, second chance of democratic elections in Cambodia? Is there any possibility that we would go a second time like we did way back in 1993?
Well, if somehow we wait until 2023 and there's another round of elections, the hope would be that enough pressure could be placed on the CPP that they'd allow political opposition groups to function and compete freely in free and fair elections. I mean, it may be that the political opposition needs to regroup under a new political party. I don't know, but the point is to allow freedom and not to crack down on CNRP supporters for doing nothing. I mean, just the other day, Sarkang ordered political leaders and police to monitor former CNRP leaders. That's a very alarming trend. It suggests that basically Cambodia is turning into an almost totalitarian type state where people are monitoring what they say. You can't call a situation like that a democracy.
Right. Well, too many Cambodians, when Cambodia has been run by a former Khmer Rouge commander and who had turned the country into authoritarian state for some time, and he is now in power. We just don't expect anything of significant change, substantial change. I mean, to allow a real democracy to flourish in Cambodia. So, my question is: do you believe the opposition CNRP would do better or worse joining the CPP? It cannot change the CPP. It has been with the CPP for some time.
I don't know how to answer that because, we're not partisan. We don't support political parties or particular forms of government over another.
Personal viewpoint.
But what we can say is that one party governments, one-party states, are not healthy as democracies. And it's more likely than not that a one-party state will not have accountability for abuses, human rights, freedoms like that. And so I don't think it would be appropriate for anybody to recommend that the solution to Cambodia's problems is for there to just be one single political party that controls everything. I would remind everybody again that the Central Committee of the CPP is essentially the security apparatus of the state. That's how things are run in Beijing and in Hanoi, and it's not healthy. You can't have democracy and freedom in a situation where the security services are the leadership of the party and vice versa. And again, you mentioned Hun Sen being a Khmer Rouge commander, but it's not just him. I mean, Kun Kim was also a commander implicated in abuses in eastern Cambodia in 1976. And people like Net Sovian, when he was the police chief in Phnom Penh, he was implicated in the torture of detainees, personally engaged in torture of detainees, according to the UN. So these people are human rights abusers. It's really kind of too late in the game to talk about them being redeemable as a political party. I think the solution is to focus on how the opposition can create a space for itself. How the change happens in the long run, nobody knows. But it's never going to happen unless there's some amount of opposition and civil society that stand up to these abusive commanders.
Okay. We have a question from our listeners and viewers named Chao Sokol. The Cambodian people need your help and America's help. Okay, your help, I don't know, your or mine, I don't know. But, okay, can you tell them how we can obtain real democracy? How to promote, real democracy, in Cambodia?
I think
we've been talking about the same thing for the last 40 years.
The thing is, I think in the United States and the EU and Japan and elsewhere, there's not a really good understanding of how bad the human rights situation has gotten. Everybody knows there were abuses in 1993, 1997, but it remains Cambodia a place where you can go on vacation if you're a European, go to the beach, go on an eco tour. I mean, people don't appreciate that the country has deteriorated since 2013 and become a one-party state. I don't think there's a wide appreciation in the United States Congress, in the administration, in the EU government, that Cambodia has gone from having a bad human rights situation to a very bad human rights situation. And I think the first step to getting better measures placed on Cambodia to force them to change is to change that mindset in Brussels and London and Japan and Australia, so that policymakers in those countries recognize how bad the situation is and start using tougher diplomacy with Cambodia. Especially Japan, by the way. Japan has been way too friendly with the CPP. And as one of the leading democracies in Asia, we would expect way more from Japan on this.
Okay. Do you think the 1991 Paris Peace Agreement would do any good at all if any member, the signatory state, would raise the issue of human rights abuse in Cambodia?
I mean, so it's not an enforceable agreement in any sense that makes it a legal document, but it's an important framework to raise issues with governments like Japan and Indonesia and the EU, which are signatories, because as a rhetorical point, as a point of argument, it serves to remember that the signatories of the Paris agreements are obligated to promote human rights in Cambodia by treaty. That's and so you go to a government like France or the EU, other members, you go to a government like Indonesia, you go to a government like Japan and the United States and say, you're obligated under this agreement to promote human rights, and you haven't done a very good job over the last 25 years, but now it's really gotten bad, and now you really need to act. It's an old agreement. Most policymakers in Washington don't even remember who negotiated it.
Sure,
I mean, I think Cambodians do because it's a big part of their history. But if you go to the White House today and meet the people who are responsible for Asia policy, they're not even familiar with the agreement. So part of our role is to remind them of the history, remind them of the importance of this historic document.
Sure. Yeah. Well, at least it's something to base on if we are going to, say something or do something on Cambodia. Do you have anything to share from your experience? So many decades on Cambodia, on Asia.
I think one other thing that needs to be mentioned is the development projects that are being undertaken throughout Cambodia by the government supported by the government of China. Is probably the most destabilizing thing that's going on right now that's not getting enough attention.
In Kakong on the seaside and also the
but
naval
also,
base.
Not just that. I mean, if you go up north, it's rural, there's not as many people, but if you go up north, the disruption of just ordinary people's livelihoods, forest dwellers, indigenous groups, people who live along the rivers, the tributary, the Mekong, the Sripak, the Sisan, they're having their livelihoods completely disrupted by hydroelectric dams, rubber plantations, and all this. And it has the potential to really destabilize Cambodia in a major way. Not to mention the fact that we're talking about indigenous people who have lived on their land for generations who are being taken off and forced into, camps where they can hardly live. So this is really serious abuses. So it's not just about the political abuses of dissidents, political opposition, Sam Rainsy, journalists in Phnom Penh. It's also about ordinary people, fishermen, forest dwellers, indigenous people throughout the whole country.
Okay. Now, let's see here. We are about to run out of time. If you have any new ideas or one quick question: is there any new report coming out of Human Rights Watch?
Thanks for asking. We will be updating the list of people we view as political prisoners. I mean, it used to be that when we talked about political prisoners for Human Rights Watch in Asia, for instance. We talk about a country like Vietnam where there's over 130 dissidents and media and journalists who are in jail just for
speaking out. Yeah.
But Cambodia, it had its problems, but it never really had like a large number of political prisoners. But now, because the CPP has locked up so many opposition leaders and prosecuted others and activists, land rights activists, we now have, well over 30 people in prison as political prisoners. And I think it's a great way to galvanize outrage because, as you know, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, we campaign in particular cases of political prisoners. And not just people who are in prison, but people who are facing charges. So we're trying to sort of use that to raise awareness. The case of the RFA reporters who have been prosecuted is another example where it's gotten international attention. And you now have international trial monitors who are set to come and attend and monitor the sentencing in October. So I think it's a great way to build up attention. We're also going to put out a report about China and the Belt and Road Initiative and how it impacts China. How it impacts Cambodia. So those are two new reports we'll have.
During your course of working on this report, collecting, gathering, prisoners of conscience or prisoners, have you ever come across any report or individuals that happen to be like in a forced disappearance, missing?
I mean, there are some cases like that, and obviously there's the unfortunate unsolved killing of Kem Lay a few years ago. One area we are concerned about is the increasing cooperation between Cambodia and its neighbors, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, to sending back people, but vice versa. Cambodia has also sent people back to Thailand. And that's this sort of extra legal rendition of dissidents from one country to another is something we're really increasingly concerned about. But not just Cambodia. Right. Vietnam has, had people pulled back, and Thailand has had people killed in Laos. Yeah. So there seems to be, although we don't have proof, there seems to be some kind of agreement between Cambodia and its neighbors, and that's something we're definitely worried about.
Right. Okay. Final question, John. What do you think about the persecution on opposition lately? There are 6 of them are now in Thailand. You care about that too?
Yeah. So first of all, recently, just in the last couple of weeks, there's been some new charges against opposition leaders in Cambodia.
Right.
Thailand really got to hit them hard to prevent them from sending Cambodian dissidents back to Cambodia. Thailand has a mixed record about this. Sometimes they have not sent people back. Sometimes they have, but it's very important that a lot of pressure be put on Thailand not to cooperate with this abusive regime.
Right. Well, I should acknowledge the listeners and viewer who just asked this question. His name is Dara Rajasan. Mm-hmm. Okay, and okay, John. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that. And
thank you very much.
You come back again at some point in the future to share your experience and knowledge.
I'd be glad to come back.
All right. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Thank you.